Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm joined by the wonderful Sagar Radia to talk all about industry. And one of the things that I was interested in, because you've had such an interesting trajectory of playing this character, and you've talked very openly about how, you definitely felt like he was more of a functional character, kind of season one, and then season two was where you started to get a little bit more. And obviously now you've had this amazing opportunity to go so in depth with the character. And I was interested in how it's really shifted the way that you approach playing him, because I remember hearing you talk about having to be very instinctive at the beginning because it was just these little details on the floor to kind of support the story. And how has that really changed for you, especially with this last season?
Not a drastic amount, if I'm honest. I think I'm just an instinctive actor by nature, so I try not to overthink too much in the way of like dialogue and scenes and arcs and journeys. I mean, they're all very important and you have to do the work towards it, but like I'm someone who tries not to overcomplicate it for myself. If I can try and keep it as simple as possible, um, then that's sort of my method. I guess to speak to what you had mentioned, because he was so functional in season one, and then had a little bit more with the Harper stuff in season two, and then obviously the standalone in three. I kind of thought, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Do you know what I mean? It was trying to keep it really as simple as possible. I think that the minute someone, or at least me, the minute I try and go, okay, well, this is the season where I do something different, I feel like it's just going to go horribly wrong. So I'm kind of on a wave right now where I'm sort of just trying to capitalize on what I've done and hopefully carry that through and see where it takes me. So fingers crossed.
It's so great. And, one of the things that I love in terms of hearing about the way the show's shot is that often in shooting scenes, yes, you have a very specific script, but that oftentimes you'll get to improv going into a scene and going out of a scene.
Yeah.
And I love that detail. And so I wanted to just ask about how that really helps in terms of just like stepping into the character and stepping into the mind frame or the emotional beat of what something's about to be.
Honestly, it purely comes from the fact that I and a lot of the other actors don't know how to improvise finance jargon. So like, it's more trying to get you into a place of naturalism and authenticity of the scene, so it doesn't look like someone's just gone action and then you start blurting out these lines. I think it's an opportunity to kind of feel like, sometimes in scenes in film and TV, we jump in midway through a conversation. So I think it's trying to make it feel like that's what we've dropped into. We've dropped into this moment on a trading floor that we just happen to capture, and then see where that conversation takes us. Yeah, it was fun to do that. I think Mickey and Conrad, the writer creators, were so um, great at giving us the license to do that. Ultimately, they were really great at going, listen, best idea wins. So we would do improvisations at the start and at the top and tail of scenes, and some were terrible and just would end up on the cutting room floor, obviously, and rightly so. And then there were some that would work. And we were also lucky that sometimes you'd get an opportunity to improvise in scenes. Like I've mentioned this before, there was a scene where in episode three where I get really angry and I just kind of dart round that desk and have a go at the character of Ali. And because I know the character was Egyptian Arab, I think I just improv that line where I say, "Hey, Mo Salah," because obviously Mo Salah is like Egyptian Arabic, and kind of thought that would be somewhat of a stereotypical insult to someone, even though it's a massive compliment. Mo Salah's a fantastic player. So those types of moments were really great, where we had an opportunity to just improv in and around things. And I know loads of actors that on the show that are really good at it. Like Ken is fantastic as an improviser, um, and he's so good in scenes where you're kind of he's improvising and you're kind of like, was that scripted? Because that was so good. Um, so if I can be even half as good as him, then I'd consider myself very lucky. So no, having the license to do it is the first step to kind of helping enhance a scene that's already good on the page. So
It It's so great, and obviously one of the huge proponents of the show is we get to watch all of these different characters constantly shifting and bending their moral compass in new ways. And I was curious about kind of like your perspective on your character, because obviously he probably was a different version of himself when he started at Pierpoint 15 years ago, but has always had elements of that to him.
Yeah.
And, over the years, like the choices that he's made have probably pushed him to where we meet him in the show. And so I was just curious about kind of your perspective on, where you think he started when he first came to the company versus where you find him now.
I think he probably starts where a lot of us start when we join something in that sort of post-teen, early 20 years where you're sort of naively going in and thinking everything's positive and everything hopefully will go smoothly and swimmingly. And sometimes that happens for people, and sometimes you're lucky enough for that to be the case. And I think Rishi would have gone in with that same attitude. Without getting too deep about it, I think there's levels of assimilation taking place as well. You know, he's a South Asian actor, a South Asian character, sorry, going into this world of banking, and is probably this second generation South Asian um, guy whose family have come over as immigrants to the country, and it's like, how do you how do you assimilate into a world that has never felt comfortable to you, you know? And I think that's where he developed that bravado and sort of that leading with his chest out kind of thing. Um, and and I think that's led to him being very sort of defensive and very front-footed in the way he speaks to people, because it's that thing of like, you don't want to feel you're almost acting like there's a shield there because you don't want people to see the real you. If they see the real you, then maybe they'll get an insight into you not being the person that you're giving off on a trading floor or any business really. Um, so I think there's a few different layers to it there that I've definitely thought about over the seasons, as to why it could be that Rishi is the way he is. If that gives any indication.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It does. And, even with what you were just describing there as well, with, being South Asian and being in this kind of very white banking world, I heard you talk at one point about how you felt like the standalone episode really gave you an opportunity to kind of play and find some of the code switching that he does. And I was interested in just some of the tweaks and nuances that you found in playing him and, suddenly seeing him where he lives and he's on the receiving end of so many microaggressions within the cricket pavilion and within this community.
I think we all experience code switching in some capacity, you know, whether we know it, sometimes whether we don't. I think we all wear different hats and take on different personalities within ourselves that get portrayed to other people, whether that's at home with your family, or whether that's with your partner, or whether that's with your work colleagues, or whether that's with your friends, or whether that's with your neighbors. Like, we all wear different hats and give off different versions of ourselves that we feel is necessary for that interaction. And I think this was a perfect opportunity to demonstrate that for Rishi's journey, because Rishi's one guy at work, but then we see him, as you mentioned, at the cricket pavilion with his, debt collector friend, but then also with his wife. And Rishi's now a new father. So what does that look like? Does he have to wear a different hat being a father? Does he have to wear a different hat when he's around his wife's family? You know, and we saw all of that, as you touched on as well, the microaggressions and what that looks like and how he has to respond in those situations. You know, I think it also raises the bigger question of who is the real Rishi? You know, we, he's wearing all those different hats in all those different situations, but which one is the real Rishi? And I think that's the question that I think is left with the audience at the end of that episode, especially when he's standing over the bed and he's looking at his wife and he goes, "Am I a misogynist?" You know, and I think he genuinely is looking at himself and kind of going, I don't know who I am. Like, am I the things that people are saying that I am? Because I don't feel like I am. And I think within those code switching that's taking place again, and I think this happens with everybody, you have to take a moment to go, all right, which one of these people is the real me? Or ultimately, am I just a little bit of every one of them? And that's just who, you know, that that combination makes up the person inside in when they're interacting with different people. It's a really deep question, and truly, I don't think there is an answer for it. I think it's different strokes for different folks. Sometimes I could be a different person at home to who I am in an audition room, or to who I am because I need to play a character. So do I kind of lean into that a little bit when I'm in a casting? But then when I'm on set with a director, do I have to have a different dynamic as well? And when I'm with my friends, some of who I'm going to see this evening, like, is that an interaction that goes back to when I was a teenager? Do you know what I mean? It's that thing of, who was I talking to? I was talking to somebody about this earlier today. How sometimes, when we go home, if you don't live with your parents and you then go and visit your parents, there's a version of us that retreats back to that 15-year-old self. It's really strange, isn't it? Like, you don't really know how that happens, but like, you suddenly are just like, oh, and you just huff and puff in a way that you're like, oh, I haven't done that in a really long time, and it's weird. And that ultimately comes down to code switching and being different people with around different people.
Yeah, definitely. And, even with what you were just touching on about that conversation that he has with his wife at the end of that episode, it's just one example of just the different trajectories and the different beats that that episode requires you to hit.
Mm.
And I know that you wanted to be very specific about, finding all of those different emotional levels throughout the episode, and working with Zoe Wittick, the director, and kind of really collaborating with her, and even some of the prep and watching Uncut Gems. And, how did the conversations with her, or looking at a movie like that, and just like the way that it carries tension, help you to figure out what that trajectory might look like so you could prep for it, but then kind of have the freedom of play when you were shooting it?
Yeah, honestly, it was such a fascinating thing to receive the script, because I genuinely, I think I initially had that panic of going, all right, where do I start? And so what I did is, we did a couple of rehearsals, which is such a lovely privilege to have on this show, in this case for this episode, because in TV it moves so quickly, you don't always get a chance. Um, that I sat down with Zoe, and the thing is, I know the character of Rishi. I'd have played him for 3 years by that point. So sorry, 2 years by that point, going into the third, and about to play him for the third. So for me, I just needed someone, as you mentioned, I just needed someone to plot where I was emotionally on that journey based on the schedule, because you always shoot out schedule. You're never doing anything chronologically. So, like, for example, the first day we were in the casino. So I'm already thrown right into the middle of like this emotional trauma that he's gone through. He's been beaten up at this point. He owes loads of people money. He's in the red at work. His wife's, I think, was ringing him like a crazy amount of times at that point, because she's like, "Where are you?" While she's at home looking after their kid. So for me, I just needed Zoe to sort of guide me along that journey of kind of going, all right, where are we today? If we look at this as a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the end of the episode and one being the start of the episode, where today, where are we on that emotional journey and that emotional level? Because it does that, doesn't it? It goes on this massive sort of crazy journey emotionally. So I just needed her to go, all right, today we're at 3, and tomorrow we're at 7, and then the next day we're at 1. And so then it allows me to kind of go, okay, I know the level to kind of pitch that at. And then sometimes you pull it back and forth and take it a bit higher. And then it gives Mickey and Conrad and the producers and everyone something to play with in the edit, and see how they want to cut that together.
Yeah, and one of the things that the show does so well as well, and I think we really see throughout that episode, is that, it kind of takes you into the darker places, but then there's kind of a lightness to it, and sometimes a little bit of humor. And one of those moments is when we see him in the club after he's had that first win at the casino, and he's just dancing by himself and kind of like trying to being his own one person hype man. And what was your experience in terms of filming a scene like that? And, even just the fun of how is he moving? Because he's really, running on an adrenaline high in that moment, but he's the only person there.
I think you just ultimately, going back to what I said at the start, which is not to overthink it, because there's such self-conscious things to do on a set, to kind of, a one thing is to just dance amongst people who you don't know in a very fabricated environment, but B, I'm now doing it on my own. which feels massively self-conscious. And actually, what we did, I don't think I've mentioned this before, but um, there's a version on the day that we shot where I start off on the dance floor. I start off dancing and I'm talking to these girls and like, oh, come and join my table, da 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 da. And then I wander up the steps and then I go to my table. And then I think I'm leaning over the banister and trying to get some other people to join me and stuff. And it didn't make the edit in the end, but like that kind of stuff really helped in terms of just getting into where they wanted to get it to. And then they were able to cut in where they wanted to cut in. So again, I think it's one of those situations as an actor where you just have to throw yourself into it and not think too much about it and feel too self-conscious because yeah, again on a set it feels so not real. So when you're just there like trying to vibe on your own, it feels so cringy. But thankfully, I think hopefully we got it. So
Yeah, no, it's such a great scene, and um, one of the other aspects of that episode in this season is that we do get to see more about his marriage and to kind of understand that relationship. And I thought it was so interesting that there's a moment where his wife says something about, oh, you're so cruel, but when you used to be cruel, it was kind of like we used to kind of like play this together and we were on the same page, but now it doesn't feel that way. And so you kind of get the impression that she really sees a lot of who he is in reality, and that's part of their chemistry in a strange way. And I was interested in just what were some of like the weird specific parts of like their chemistry or their love language with each other that you discovered from this season.
yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. It was that thing of like, I think, yeah, she says to him, like, when we were cruel, we used to be cruel together. And that, I get a sense that she knew what she was marrying, she knew the type of man he was. She knew he was work hard, play hard. She knew he'd love to go out and have a good time. She probably knew he was a bit of a gambler and sort of lived in like a high stakes world. And that was just where he lived. And that's where he got off on, and that was where his adrenaline was at. And I think she was just like, "Cool, I understand the guy I'm marrying," and that's just ultimately probably what works for her as well. She was probably slightly turned on by it. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I think that's what they felt with each other. And in a way, there's a really interesting moment in when they're arguing in the kitchen where she says to him, "Oh, I'm not just your country wife," or something along those lines. I think she says. And actually, I remember, reading that and then being in the scene, kind of going, "I wonder if this is who Rishi thought he was going to end up with. Whether he wants that type of person, or whether he just feels a safety in that type of person, but actually he likes the high life and he likes, a fast person, the same pace as him." Um, and truthfully, it's not an answer I've necessarily come to because, sometimes I imagine people in relationships don't always know, the person they're with, whether that's the person they want to be with or are going to be with, and people settle, and some people are the opposite and are really happy with the people that they've ended up with, and I think Rishi in this situation is genuinely not sure. And I think I was happy to leave it at that. I don't think it needed an answer, um, because there's so much on his plate at this moment. So I think him thinking about the happiness of his place in his relationship is probably not at the forefront of his mind at that point.
I know, because even when we see him go into the office the next day and he's been up the entire night and, he's been beaten to a pulp by that guy in the club, it's quite jarring to see the fragility in someone like him in a way that we haven't gotten the chance to see it before. And you kind of feel like if someone said, the right or the wrong thing, that he might just burst into tears in the middle of the floor in front of everyone. How did you find the space of what that was going to feel like? Of, he's had this adrenaline fueled night, but he's also now completely broken, but there's all this tension and it's just this fragile guy in the middle of the floor in front of all his co-workers.
I think exactly what you said. I think it was just trying to play and lean into that fragility and what that looked like. As you said, he's just been beaten up. He's lost all his money in the casino. So it's almost just using that and having that at the forefront of your mind, walking onto the floor, thinking, all right, what's the impact of what's just happened? Um, whilst also trying to mask it a little bit. I mean, he doesn't mask it very well at all, but like it's trying to mask it in a sense of like that's what we do sometimes. We walk into rooms and whatever's going on in our lives, we try and pretend to be a version of ourselves that we want to be in that room. You know, whether you've gone through a breakup or an argument with someone, or you've lost your job, or whatever it may be. When you then walk into a room with people who you don't necessarily want to be able to read that on you, you try and mask it. I think Ken says, "What happened to you?" when he says, "I walked into a door." Like he's like, "I'm not interested in having this conversation with anybody right now. Let's just get on with the day, and forget what you're looking at right now." And that was kind of the way I tried to approach it. Again, if you try and attack it from the point of view of like, I'm feeling this, and then this has happened and this has happened, then I think it can overcomplicate it for you. Um, in terms of the way you play it, and you can almost overplay it. So the key thing for me was, as you said, like play the fragility and just leave it at that, because then the rest reads. You can see his face, you can see he's in a bad place. And then when he gets to work and he sees his screen and he's like losing so much money, again, that tells you everything you need to know as well. So again, it comes back to that thing of trying not to overcomplicate it for myself as an actor.
Yeah, and that episode as well, we also kind of see him getting called up on his language and his actions in the workplace by HR, which I think the HR department at Pierpoint have been one of the most absent HR departments in history.
They do
All they
have
would
a
need to do is
very
walk through the floor and they'd have to fire everyone probably. um, but it was interesting hearing you talk previously about shooting the scene in front of his coworkers where he's kind of being confronted with his own language, and he's like, well, this is what makes me good at my job, and is this a problem? Am I the problem? And I've heard you say that you found a little bit of space of not being quite sure if you felt like you'd found the right tone for a scene like that, and so wanted to ask about your experience in shooting that and kind of the different spaces that you tried along the way.
I don't know. I think I was maybe just feeling a bit self-conscious that day. I don't particularly. I remember leaving that scene going, I just don't think we got it. I just don't think we nailed it. And the boys and Zoe and everyone were like, no, no, it was good, and it was just what we needed, and it was at the right level. And sometimes you just have to trust the people around you to kind of go, okay, they feel like we've got it. And sometimes as an actor, you can overthink a scene too much about how you think it was going to go, and then the way it goes. Uh, Sometimes it can be as simple as like the way the layout was. Maybe in my head, I remember reading it thinking we'd be in a room where we're sort of all in a circle, and it's like almost a bit more traditionally intervention like. And of course, that's not going to be the case because they're in a working environment, and it would probably take place in one of the boardrooms, which it did. Um, so I guess sometimes it was a lesson to me as an actor to kind of not try and play out too much what I think it should be, and actually just go with what it was going to be on the day. And I remember just kind of, I don't know, I think I just felt like I didn't personally hit the emotional levels that I wanted to again in my head. Um, but people were happy with it, and the way it came out, and ultimately that's the most important thing.
Yeah, no, it's a great scene in terms of the performance. And in talking a little bit about the final episode as well, that's a space where all of a sudden we think that he's hit rock bottom in episode 4, and then all of a sudden we find out that wasn't his rock bottom. He owed £200,000. Now his wife bailed him out of that, and now he's in deep for 500, for half a million. What was that like to kind of find, okay, actually everything that he went through in this episode, he hasn't learned a single thing, and actually he's just gotten himself even deeper into all of it.
I mean, you kind of throw your hands up in the air a little bit, don't you, and just be like, what is wrong with this guy? Like, he's just not learning his lesson. And actually, it's an interesting thing to take yourself out of that, and look at it from the audience's perspective, because ultimately, when you watch a TV show or a film, there's always consequences to somebody's bad actions at the end of it. So, for example, we spoke about Uncut Gems. What happened there? You take like, I don't know, you look at some of the classic mafia films like a Goodfellas or something like. There's always consequences to people's bad actions, and you get to the end of episode 4 and you're going, he got away with that. Like he absolutely got away with that. And how are we still here hating him but still rooting for him at the same time? It was such a weird position to be in, from the feedback that I got from people. So then when you get to episode 8 and you're like, okay, what's going to happen here? Because something's got to give. Something's got to give. There has to be repercussions for his actions, and I think ultimately most of the audience and me too, before I read it, thought, okay, this could be the end for Rishi here. But it was a smart choice from the boys because ultimately, who better to suffer for him? What better way for Rishi to suffer than attacking the person closest to him and then seeing the repercussions of that and how he ends up feeling about that. I think it was a really smart move to do it that way because, you're left going, okay, what happens to Rishi now? What Rishi do we see next? And that's a great place to kind of, I think, to have ended his season.
I know I can't wait to see some of the answers to that next season, and loved that we got to see so much more of your character, and that standalone episode was fantastic. So thank you so much. Appreciate
Well,
it.
very kind. Thank you.